How the Falcons handled press man coverage played a big part in their loss to the Saints and may play an even bigger part in their upcoming matchup against the Denver Broncos.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is sponsored by FanDuel. We're going to help you start a season with a big return. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com to get started. So if you don't know me, my name is Aaron Freeman. I'm your very humble host. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And become an everydayer, it's easy, right? All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, for those of you that are everydayers or not everydayers, whatever floats your boat, is a All-22 review where we watch the film of the Falcons' most recent matchup against the New Orleans Saints in Week 10, and I'll give you some of my sort of thoughts from watching the film. Later in the episode, we'll talk about the Falcons' quote-unquote new look 4-3 defense. We'll talk about the recent addition of Jakeem Grant and how that may impact the Falcons' return units. But we'll start off talking about the offense and sort of revisiting Kirk Cousins, a comment I made on yesterday's episode. I thought Kirk played reasonably well watching the film. I've seen a lot of criticism of his play in this game. I understand that to a certain extent, but I feel like a lot of those issues, I don't necessarily have the same issues that other people say. Now, if you recall on our rapid reaction episode that we recorded Sunday evening after the Saints loss, we put Kirk as a level 4 on the Kirk Cousins chaos meter, which is a chaotic game. And, I do feel like outside of a handful of plays, the fumbles, the interception, it was mostly a level 2 type of performance for Kirk for like 95% of the game, but it's that 5% that sort of pushed it into the level 4 chaos. And so, usually that type of combination of, hey, Kirk's level 2 game managers type of stuff, doing a good job or an effective job managing the game, and we get a little bit of that 5% chaos. That's usually the formula for getting, peak Kirk Cousins, that level 3 of Kirk Cousins, the best version of Kirk Cousins. But obviously you need the chaotic plays to, go in your favor as opposed to go against you like they did in the Saints game in order to get that peak Kirk Cousins. So to me, this game, overall, to me, was certainly not Kirk Cousins' best game, certainly not his worst game. To me, it was but probably if I was ranking it in among the 10 games that we've seen, it's probably in the top 5. It might be 4 or 5. I don't know where exactly it is, but it's probably somewhere around there. So, I don't feel like Kirk deserves maybe as much criticism as getting in certain sectors among the fan base and media for the performance this past Sunday. Now, one of the criticisms I've seen is that Kirk got off to a slow start in this game, and I don't know if I agree with that. I feel like the issues that the Falcons had early in the game in the passing game had more to do with the wide receivers not necessarily beating the man coverage that the Saints were dialing up early in the game. And I know Greg Olsen for Fox Sports commented on this during the broadcast, so talking about how the Saints were playing more man coverage than teams, than expected, given the Falcons, plethora of weapons at the wide receiver position. And I would say for the first 20 or so minutes of the game, it was mostly effective, right? Through the first 5 minutes of the second quarter. But then after that point, I think the Falcons started doing a better job winning. And that kind of started on the 4th drive where you saw Kirk and Darnell Mooney link up a couple of times around the 10-minute mark in the second quarter. That started out with a 19-yard reception from Darnell Mooney where he was lined up in the slot, and moving him to the slot was one of the ways that I think the Falcons were trying to counteract the press coverage, something that we talked about last week leading into the game. In terms of what I expected the Saints to try to do in order to slow down, the Falcons' top explosive playmaker like Darnell Mooney by pressing him a ton, which, they tried. And then later in the game, he was able to beat that press coverage, or later in that drive, I should say, in the second quarter, he was able to beat that press coverage and get an explosive play on a 33-yard gain. So, I was curious how Zach Robinson was going to try to counteract this sort of expectation from the Saints defense. And, the expectation was like he'd use bunch formations, motion, he'd move Mooney into the slot where it's a little bit harder to press receivers from the slot than it is on the outside. And he did all those things, right? He did all of the above. Just sort of took him a minute, right? That fourth drive was the 16th play, that it started out with the 16th play of the drive. Usually you script the first 15 plays. So is that a coincidence? Maybe. Again, we'll see. But it did feel like they started to make those adjustments. And about 60% of Darnell Mooney's snaps against the Saints came in the slot. He has one other game where he had a similar percentage of against Kansas City. Outside those two games against the Saints and in Kansas City, he averages about 35% of his snaps coming in the slot, or at least his, running routes, I should say, because that's not factoring in all the times he's asked to block and whatnot. And this was the third game of the season. The Saints game was the third game of the season where the majority of his targets came when he was lined up in the slot. Kansas City was the other one. The Dallas game previous week was the other one. So, I think we'll break down several of those plays, whether it's the press coverage stuff, whether it's the slot stuff, when we get to the extended All-22 review. Check it out in the link in the description below, where we look at the HD, film. If you're a visual learner as opposed to an audio learner, becoming a Locked On Falcons insider to get access to that extended All-22 review is there for you. I'll plug more of that at the end of today's episode and how you can get access to that. But, one of the things I think in regards to sort of Mooney's usage and Zach Robinson's play calling and trying to play this chess match of, defense does one thing, you counteract, all that stuff that is an ongoing thing in the NFL, is how that's going to impact this upcoming matchup against the Denver Broncos, because the Broncos play one of the highest rates of man coverage in the NFL. And from the data I've seen, they also play a healthy percentage of press coverage. They tend to be in the upper half of the league. Now, the data I saw is basically a month old at this point in time, so maybe we'll see. But at least based off of the remaining teams on our schedule going through like the first 6 or so weeks of the season, the Broncos are probably the team that plays the most press coverage. So in terms of if beating press man is an issue for the Falcons, or at least, as it was for 1.25 quarters in this, or 1.3 quarters in this Saints game, the Broncos are the team that most likely can make that an issue for much longer, especially because they have a high caliber corner like Patrick Surtain. Again, the Falcons struggled with that for a quarter plus, basically dealing with the Saints lesser corners, because no Marshawn Lattimore, no Paulson Adebo, all that stuff, and more, no Kool-Aid McKinstry. Alontae Taylor was still there, but that sort of thing. So, I'm curious to see how the Broncos play the Falcons. I think this is going to be an interesting part of this upcoming matchup. Patrick Surtain, their top corner, arguably the best corner in the NFL, tends to shadow the opposing team's number one. Who is he going to shadow this week against the Falcons? Is it going to be Darnell Mooney? Is it going to be Drake London? Now, if it was me, if I'm consulting Vance Joseph, which I'm not, but he can watch the show, he can become an everyday if he wants to. If I'm constructing the game plan that I think, if I'm the Broncos, I would come up with to deal with the Falcons offense, I'd probably put Surtain on Mooney, right? Because that way, in theory, that should be able to put a lid on some of the explosive plays that the Falcons can generate. But you could also you could argue and say, well, let's put Surtain on Drake London. And, Drake's role primarily in this offense is to move the chains. So that's going to be very valuable getting stops on third downs if we put Surtain on Drake. And then we'll put Riley Moss on Darnell Mooney, and we'll give him consistent safety help. And that's going to help eliminate some of the explosive plays. This is how teams, not teams, but how Bill Belichick, I remember, guarded against Julio Jones. Right, not saying Darnell Mooney's on the same level as Julio Jones. We're going to get a couple more games before Mooney gets on the goat wall behind me, alongside Julio Jones, Toph Beifong, and Aaron Donald. 3 goats. We need a little bit more from Darnell Mooney before he goes up on the goat wall at that caliber. But it is one strategy to sort of deal with that, to try to limit the explosiveness of a playmaker like Darnell Mooney, who is producing explosive plays at a rate not too dissimilar to Julio Jones this season. So I'll be curious to see what they do. The Broncos But basically, my expectation is whoever the Broncos decide to put Surtain on, whoever he isn't on, I should say, right? He's going to shut down or he's going to keep a lid on whoever that is. Maybe not shut him down, but he's going to keep a lid on that guy. And then the other guy, whoever is not being covered by Surtain every snap, is going to have to kind of carry the offense just because that's how good Patrick Surtain is. And so it'll be interesting to see what adjustments they make in order to allow that to happen, right? Will Zach Robinson sort of tailor the offense to feature whoever that player is? And if Surtain does guard Mooney, right, and it keeps a lid on him as he has done so many other wide receivers in the NFL, how do the Falcons generate the explosive plays that they need to potentially in order to win this game, right? Because Mooney is responsible for 40% of the Falcons' 20-plus yard explosive plays this year. And normally you would say, oh, well, okay, well, we might not get as many explosive plays as we would want, from the passing game if Mooney's, kept, in check by Patrick Surtain, but we can still run the football, right? And that will allow us to still be methodical in terms of moving the football. That's going to be tough against the Broncos, who essentially have a top 5 run defense. And so that's going to be tough sledding for the Falcons. We'll see if the Falcons can run the ball effectively against a defense of that caliber. That will be another feather in the potential hat of this offensive line if they can get the job done. I'm not particularly optimistic, not because I hate the offensive line or anything like that. I haven't seen them be that effective for extended stretches of games. I've seen 1 or 2 good drives running the football against good run defenses, but not the 4 or 5 that you're probably going to need in order to score points. So we'll see on that front. But, I'll start diving into the Broncos film. I know that the Broncos are not necessarily a team, despite having Patrick Surtain, that is, stops teams from generating explosive plays. They're like league average when it comes to that. And so one of the things I'm going to pay attention to is how are they, giving up those explosive plays, or is it guys coming in slot? And so that may be something that Zach Robinson does to counteract this sort of variable, which is, give Darnell Mooney or whoever is on Surtain in the slot, put him in the slot so that Surtain doesn't follow him nearly as much and feature him that way. And so that will be something that we will probably continue to talk about as a topic of discussion here on this illustrious podcast in the coming days in the lead up to this week 11 matchup. But the topic of discussion that we will continue on today's episode will be the Falcons' usage of the 4-3 defense, and sort of, can we expect more of this after getting a little taste of it against the New Orleans Saints? And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is going to give you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get that hunch in the middle of the game, you can go and check out the latest stats, view the live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page that you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. And again, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Check out the line for this upcoming Falcons-Broncos action, as well as the lines for so many other football action this weekend, as well as NBA, college football. It's all there for you at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. PrizePicks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 10 million active members, because it's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports, because unlike on other apps, PrizePicks, it's you against the numbers. Pick more or less on at least 2 player stat projections, and you can watch the winnings roll in, and you can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. And this is going to be a challenge this week, because one of my correct picks every single week is just like, hey, take the more on Darnell Mooney when it comes to receiving yards, and take the more on either Bijan rushing or receiving yards depending on the matchup. It's like 2 guaranteed picks, and so now I'm concerned with this Broncos matchup. Like, is Mooney going to be that money maker that he has been week in and week out over at PrizePicks? And of course, you want to check it out at PrizePicks, because maybe you can't get in on the action because certain sports books aren't available in your state. But don't worry, PrizePicks is, especially in the state of Georgia, and withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure, and you get your money in as quickly as 15 minutes. So check it out by downloading PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play $5. PrizePicks, run your game. So we saw the Falcons unveil some 4-3 looks in their base defense against the Saints in Week 10. And for those of you that have been living under a rock or just don't follow the Falcons on a regular basis and decided randomly, I'm going to check out this illustrious podcast that I've been hearing so much about, Locked On Falcons. The Falcons are not a 4-3 team. They're a 3-4 team. Now, they only played 4-3 by my count 6 times in this game, and compared to the roughly 30 times that they played, 3-4 in their base defense in this game. They had, roughly, I think 37, 36 some odd snaps in this game. And so it's hard to really draw any significant conclusions because you have a massive difference in sample size. But in general, the 4-3 was generally effective, just like in general, the 3-4 was generally effective. It was basically once after the first quarter, the Falcons, defense played well. The first quarter, they did not play well, outside of the explosive plays they gave up, which they gave up a couple in the second and third quarter. But, after that point, it didn't matter what defense they were mostly keeping a clamp on the Saints offense. Now, when they were playing 4-3, they had Troy Anderseon playing that strong side or Sam linebacker. They had Nate Landman in the middle as that Mike linebacker, and they had Caden Ellis at the weak side as that Will linebacker. And by my count, there were 4 instances on the 6 plays they were in 4-3 where they were running the 4-3 under front, and 2 instances where they were in a 4-3 over front. Now, if you're not familiar with under versus over, it's basically determined by which side does the 3 technique defensive tackle line up on. If he's on the weak side, it's an under front. If he lines up on the strong side, it's an over front. And for those of you that may not know or recall, the 4-3 under was basically the front that the Falcons ran almost exclusively under Dan Quinn during his tenure in Atlanta. Now, most of the time the Falcons did have Troy Anderseon lining up on the line of scrimmage like a traditional edge rusher, which is one of the reasons why we've talked in the past about how the 4-3 under front is kind of a hybrid of the 4-3 in the 3-4, because you put that Sam linebacker and he basically functions no differently than a 3-4 outside linebacker does when he lines up on the line of scrimmage. But one time they did have all 3 linebackers in a stack position, that 31-yard screen to Alvin Kamara, where Troy Anderseon did suffer re-aggravated his knee injury, was that instance where they did play in the stack. Although I think Landman lined up in the A gap because he was rushing on that play. So there was a couple of times either Landman or Ellis lined up in the A gap so that they could run a sim pressure with those 4-3 looks. But as I said, Troy re-aggravated his knee injury on that 31-yard screen to Alvin Kamara in the third quarter. So I don't know if we're going to see much of the 4-3 moving forward, right? Without, him functioning as that third healthy linebacker, although, it's not out of the realm of possibilities that the Falcons might dabble with it with J.D. Bertrand, hopefully not with Rashaan Evans. We do not want to see a world where Rashaan Evans and Nate Landman are on the field at the same time. That is my nightmare. And that is the dream of every quarterback and offensive coordinator in the NFL. But, if they were going to do it with J.D. Bertrand, I would imagine they would have Bertrand playing the Will linebacker and Caden Ellis actually playing the Sam linebacker in that particular instance. But we heard a lot of hype about the 3 linebacker looks that the Falcons would potentially unveil this season. We didn't, I wasn't really buying that much into it. So we got 6 plays of it. We'll see if we get more of it. And of course, you're going to sit here and say, well, we would have got more of it, Aaron, if guys had been healthy, because we've only really had all 3 of these guys healthy for 2 games, the season opener against the Steelers, and then this past week against the Saints, and only for 3 quarters in this past week against the Saints. So that's true, so maybe theoretically it's possible that we could have seen more of this, in the 8 intervening weeks, had all of those guys been healthy, with Landman missing 4 of those games and Troy missing 5 of those games during that period of time. But, speaking of Troy Anderson's injury, I've seen a lot of people, because of the news Monday that he re-aggravated that issue, I've seen a lot of people being either critical of Troy Anderseon or being critical of the team for how they handled his injury. I don't really get that. I don't really get the idea of attacking a person because they can't stay healthy or they aren't healthy as if they really have any control over that. I don't really understand the notion that the Falcons attacking the team and criticizing the team because they didn't put Troy Anderseon on IR 5 weeks ago. I don't see why opening up a roster spot for probably Josh Woods would have made really any difference at some point, unless you're basically arguing that, if Josh Woods had been active against the Seahawks, we would have prevented all 6 of those explosive plays at Seattle. He would have shut down DK Metcalf. Like, unless you're making that argument, I don't understand what that is based off of, nor do I understand people trying to connect him not going on IR at that point in time to him re-injuring himself this past week. Like, it's the idea of like, well, if he wasn't practicing 18 days ago, working back from that initial injury, and instead he would have been on IR, there was no chance he would have gotten hurt, 3 quarters into the Saints game. And it's just like you're drawing correlations that don't really correlate. But I'll let that go. I probably won't let it go, but I've seen a lot of sort of like rhetoric surrounding Troy. People get weird about Troy's injury. And I think people tend to want to think that players and or teams have a lot more control about how players get hurt. And sometimes it sucks. We know availability is the best ability, and Troy hasn't been particularly available these last couple of years. Hopefully he will be more available in the future. If not, then we'll see how the Falcons deal with that. If that means more opportunities for JD Bertrand or Nate Landman, we'll see if those guys can take advantage of those opportunities or not, or the Falcons go out there and get more help at the linebacker position. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm never against the team adding more talent to the roster, but we'll see how that all goes. But I've seen a lot of sort of pushback, with Troy's injury issue, and I just needed to get that off my chest. But speaking of guys that can't stay healthy, let's talk about Jakeem Grant and the addition of him and what he may do to the Falcons return game. And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Hey, Falcon fan, do you remember our great partner, Ultimate Pro Football GM? Well, they're back, and they've added an amazing new game mode. Not only can you get your Terry Fontenot on as the general manager and lead your team to glory, but Ultimate Pro Football GM now has a new head coach career mode. So on top of building your dynasty by drafting players, signing free agents, hiring coaches, you also get to call offensive plays. Ultimate Pro Football GM is completely free with no ads and 100% playable offline. So play on the go as you want, when you want. And here's a special offer for our Locked On listeners. Use the promo code Locked On NFL, all caps, in one word, inside the game store to receive a free boost to your franchise. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. Ultimate Pro Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So I thought we would get some announcements of roster moves Tuesday afternoon. We did not get that. We'll probably get those Wednesday, but there was a report that the Falcons are bringing back kick returner Jakeem Grant to their practice squad. If you may recall, Jakeem Grant was briefly on the roster during training camp. Then he got injured after like the second day of practice, went on IR. And then, the team wound up cutting him from IR and now potentially bringing him back. Grant, my snarky comment from before, Grant has dealt with injuries these last couple of years. He tore his Achilles during the preseason in 2022. He ruptured his patellar tendon in his knee in the preseason in 2023. And obviously, dealt with whatever injury he suffered this past summer with the Falcons for the 4 days that he was on the team. And so we'll see who the Falcons move on from to free up this roster spot, because as far as I know, with the addition of Lamar Jackson, no, not that Lamar Jackson, the cornerback, earlier this week, they are full on their 16-man practice squad. But they have 5 receivers on their practice squad. No real reason to carry that many receivers. But now that they've potentially added Jakeem Grant, you have Philip Dorsett, you have Chris Blair, who was just active this past Sunday, Jesse Matthews, Dylan Drummond are the other guys on the roster. So or practice squad, I would assume the Falcons will move on from one of those guys to bring in Grant. Dorsett is the most recent guy, and so usually that's the guy that winds up getting hurt in that process, but we'll see. I think Jakeem Grant theoretically should potentially provide a boost to the return game. We'll see if he gets that opportunity. The Falcons are currently dead last in starting field position in the NFL this year. Now, that's not all on a return game. There's a lot of variables that go into that: the bend but don't break defense, turnovers, kickoff depth, touchbacks, all that and more. But when you do focus on drives that exclusively start with kickoffs, the Falcons are still bottom 10 in terms of average starting field position. So not good, but not the worst in the NFL. But clearly, you would probably benefit from better starting field position if you were getting better returns. And so that's where a guy like Jakeem Grant theoretically could help. Now, when we signed him back in August, we talked about it on the podcast and what it could potentially mean at that point. And the thought process was, Ray-Ray McCloud is going to be a full-time offensive player and won't really have, time. He would be on a pitch count as a return threat. And, that's why you're bringing in Jakeem Grant, to be that second guy on the kickoff return team with Avery Williams. And that was during the portion of the summer when we were still excited and all a buzz about, what this new dynamic kickoff return could be and how impactful that could be. And, it hasn't really been as dynamic as I think we hoped it would be up to this point. We'll see how it goes league wide for the rest of the season. But, the question is going to be if Jakeem Grant is brought in to be a return specialist, which is what he has been throughout his NFL career, and a very productive one throughout his NFL career. I think he's made 2 Pro Bowls, if I'm not mistaken. As a return specialist, is he replacing Ray McCloud or is he replacing Avery Williams on the kickoff return team? Now, I've seen others argue, and I'm sure many of you would agree, that the one that you would be most willing to replace is Avery Williams, right? Just given some questionable decisions he's made, not only as a punt returner, but not also looking as explosive as you ideally would want him to look as a kickoff returner. And I've seen some liken that to him returning from that ACL injury that cost him all of last season. I don't know if I agree with that, just because I don't think Avery Williams has ever really been that explosive, right? Like if you were putting him in a foot race, you were putting him on the Drake London versus Darnell Mooney spectrum of speed. He's much closer to Drake London than he is to Darnell Mooney. It's one of the reasons why I wasn't that high on Avery Williams when we first got him, because I was just like, man, this is like the slowest. I need a sundial the time these returns. But he eventually grew on me. But I don't know if you're outright replacing Avery Williams just because he performs other functions on special teams, like being the personal protector on the punt team, right? So even if he does, and Grant doesn't really contribute on coverage units. So, if you do bring Grant up to the roster at some point, he'd be there purely to return, right? And the player that's most likely to get hurt by that is not really Avery Williams. It's going to be Casey Washington, because Casey Washington is basically that last wide receiver spot on the active roster. Now, his role on special teams, he's been playing with special teams pretty regularly over the last 5 or so weeks, primarily filling in on kickoff return as a blocker on those dynamic kickoffs, in the same role that Micah Abernathy filled prior to his injury earlier this season. But typically the Falcons have kept 3 active running backs on game day and 5 active wide receivers. Grant theoretically would be that 5th wide receiver, with Avery Williams being the 3rd running back that stays active. And so that 5th wide receiver currently is occupied by Casey Washington. So they did activate 6 wide receivers last week with Chris Blair. But again, I think a lot of that had more to do with, concerns about Drake London's health and availability and wanting to have an insurance policy in the event that he re-aggravated his hip pointer. Although, I don't think anybody's going to be talking about the Falcons should have put him on IR or anything like that. But, we did get to see Casey Washington play 1 snap as a punt gunner, replacing Antonio Hamilton on the return team. I haven't heard anything if Hamilton sort of re-aggravated his back injury, something that he's been battling with the last month. And then prior to that was dealing with a groin injury. Although, again, did the Falcons botch that by not putting him on IR at the beginning of the season? Again, sorry for the snark, but so I think if we do see Jakeem Grant, I don't, he might replace Avery Williams on the return team, but he's really going to be replacing Casey Washington on the active roster. So if you're, Casey Washington is secretly the next Puka Nacua, which I know there are many of you that still believe that, that's probably those dreams are potentially going to be dashed more so than, we'll see what happens with Avery Williams. But, the easy solution is what we talked about in August, which is like, Jakeem Grant's going to be on the return team with Avery Williams, and he's going to be replacing Ray McCloud so that Ray McCloud can be more of a full-time wide receiver, just because he's, playing like 97% of the offensive snaps at this point in time. And so maybe the Falcons want to keep him fresh for the second half of the season as much as possible by eliminating his role on that kickoff return team. So we'll see if the Jakeem Grant move moves the needle for this Falcons return game and special teams moving forward. We'll see what's what with this upcoming Broncos matchup tomorrow on Crossover Thursday with Locked On Broncos, previewing that matchup. So continue to keep it locked here on Locked On Falcons as your first listen, and check out the extended All-22 review by becoming a Locked On Falcons insider by hitting the link in the description below so that you can see, All-22. You can actually see the All-22 that I'm talking about in these games, talking about Kirk Cousins, talking about Darnell Mooney, talking about the 4-3 defense and some of that stuff. Maybe we'll even throw in some Eddie Goldman plays. The Eddie Goldman brand is strong. It runs strong in my family. I don't know. Why did I try to force a Star Wars reference in there? Yeah, we'll see what's what. So hit that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. Become a Locked On Falcons insider so you get access to that extended All-22 review that will drop on Wednesday, and you get a 14-day free trial. So you can try it out for free. Check it out for free. Try it out for 2 weeks. Get this All-22 review. Get the next one. Get whatever we do during the bye week for free. And then if you like it, keep it for $4.99 a month thereafter. So that's all available for you if you become a Locked On Falcons insider by hitting that link in the description below. And of course, continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check out Locked On NFL for your second listen, 2 shows daily. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every